indigenous leaders, then you will find out that no, that they have counter discourses, competing discourses of risk, and that in some occasions, and in many occasions, they're not unwarranted, right? Like people do have a history of losing big. So those are the kinds of things, and that's I think the main point that I want to make. So just getting back and keep on going with the concepts of risk, right? There's certainly Ulrich Beck's book, Risk Society, which this particular student is very much interested in, and she cited, and that was her point of departure. And Beck's argument in Risk Society, probably going to butcher it, but it goes kind of like this, right? That, and it dovetails with what we've been discussing in terms of Foucauldian biopolitical societies, right? That modernist societies are societies that begin to imagine the objective of government to care for populations as biologically living beings and to create a milieu, a collection of arrangements between people and things and resources in order to be able to provide all those things. So you begin to build things like infrastructure, bridges, but you begin to create all kinds of arrangements among people and things in order to provide for that. But the risk society, and that's the biopolitical society, but the risk society is the fact that this kind of modernization brings with it a new collection of unexpected hazards. So, for example, a nuclear power plant could be said to be a part of the milieu of a biopolitical society. That Zapotec people, prior to the arrival of Spaniards, didn't think about the need for electric power and electric energy. They didn't have factories that needed to be powered through electricity, right? They actually did most of their production of things that we would call commodities in the household, and they did it with all alternative forms of energy. But under conditions of industrialization and the idea of society as something that must produce for the well-being of people as biopolitical beings, then we have to have factories. Industrialization comes into being, and then we need electricity, we need power, right, to provide for all these things. And so nuclear energy under those instances then comes to be seen as something that is necessary, that in another cultural context would not, right? And that's the modernist biopolitical context. We need to take care of all these people. We need to care for them as biologically living beings. So we need energy. And there's, for example, I think if I'm not mistaken, Germany has ordered the closing of all of its nuclear power plants, right? So some members of the EU are saying, yeah, this is originally in the mid-20th century, nuclear power plants seemed like a great idea. But the more that we got to learn about nuclear power, we realized that it came with all kinds of problems, right? It came with the problem of what do you do with the radioactive waste? What do you do with the danger of malfunction, that it can actually kill a lot of people? So that's what risk society becomes. Risk society becomes that originally in the early modern period, or in the high modern period of the mid-20th century, we were celebrating a lot of the advances of modernity, not realizing the dangers that we were engendering in the process, right? Like the danger of radioactive fallout. And risk society becomes a modern society has become aware of all of the risks that is political, that is systems of production, distribution, and the production of biopolitical well-being engender. And that new kinds of vulnerabilities are engendered, right? So, for example, when you develop a society that has very extensive systems of commodity circulation, and we are not all self-sufficient, then you become extremely vulnerable to something like sabotage, right? And so all of these concerns become a part of governance. So anthropologists who have been thinking about this, and here's the other sticking point of the lecture. Anthropologists who have a very different methodology from the one that I have proposed that while Foucault envisioned or talked about biopolitical society, that we now have moved into a new dimension of biopolitics. It's been another transition, and that's the emergence of what they call vital systems security. That the biopolitical society is just concerned with how to provide all these things for production and well-being, but vital system security is a new type of form of governance where not only is the state concerned with the production of biopolitical well-being through the production of things like nuclear power plants, but also becomes aware that those mechanisms for providing for biopolitical well-being create all kinds of risks. So they must develop all kinds of systems to make sure that secondary risk, right? The primary risk that the biopolitical society is trying to address is we got to make sure people have enough energy. We got to make sure people have enough food. And the secondary risks are, well, we have to make sure that the networks of food distribution don't get sabotaged. We have to make sure that the nuclear power plants don't malfunction, right? And that's vital system security. And there are these vital systems that then societies become extremely concerned with. Now, I think that's very interesting, and I think the work of Collier and Lakoff is fantastic, and they help us ask all kinds of questions, but I have some issues with it, or some concerns, or some questions. And some of them come from method. So, Collier and Lakoff come from a very Foucaultian-oriented approach. The particular article in which they write about this is not ethnographically based. It's based mostly on archival research, and it is being based mostly of a policy. And there's really no ethnographic content. And what I'm wondering, as an anthropologist who is still committed to the importance of ethnography in the field, because some anthropologists just don't do ethnography anymore. I'm just wondering, what is missed? So we have this vital systems security state in a new way of defining and of legitimizing sovereignty and state power, but how does that actually work in practice, and are there certain complications that Collier and Lakoff can't pick up on because they're not necessarily using an ethnographic method? And can we pick up on those things by actually doing the ethnography of post-Harvey recovery? And so the quick answer is yes, and I want to talk about that in what remains of this presentation, for the next 15 minutes or so. So the questions that I have is, well, sure. So we have this new transition, right? Foucault talks about the emergence of the biopolitical state, and Collier and Lakoff are saying, well, now we're having vital system security states emerge. And then I want to ask ethnographically, but well, how do vital system security, how does it actually bear out ethnographically? What does it look like on the ground? And how does vital system security become related, sorry for the misspelling there, become related to neoliberal moral economies of risk and things like deregulation? And so I wanted to use the case of the ethnography of risk in post-Harvey Houston. And so here's a little image of Houston. And one of the interesting thing about Houston is that these various forms of risk, financial risk, but also environmental risk, and also things like toxic risk, all become very, very densely entangled, and have become densely entangled through the ethnographic project that I'm doing. So although Harvey is the result of what some people would consider to be an environmental disaster and relates to environmental types of risk, we'll see how all these other types of risk are actually wound up and involved in it, which makes it, to me, a pretty interesting site. So, like Dr. Chabrinska said, I got lucky, or I don't know if I got lucky, or I was very grateful to the program officers of the National Science Foundation, Jeff Mance and Deborah Winslow, who, when Harvey occurred, I inquired whether I could submit a proposal for a grant, and they welcomed it, and they supported the work, and hopefully they'll support it even more in years to come. We'll see. And so I got this grant in October of 2017, and it is a one-year grant, and hopefully we'll apply for a renewal. And we wanted to go and do this ethnography of disaster recovery. And the way that it relates to risk is that the research question that we were asking was, so as I have said, disasters, whether they're financial disasters or socio-environmental disasters, they're processes, they're not events, right? In the representations that you often see in media, people talk about, they only talk about disaster as the event, right? The disaster is the hurricane itself. And that's what we sometimes mistakenly call the hazard-centered approach to disasters, right? The hurricane is the disaster, the earthquake is the disaster. And for the anthropologists, no, that's just a phase of the disaster, and it's not even the end of the disaster. And the disaster constitutes the entire process of risk-taking behavior, or of the engendering of risk that eventually culminates in this particular explosion, either a stock market crash or a flood. And then it continues indeterminately into the future, and as some anthropologists say, eventually descends into everyday life, because the recovery itself is a part of the process of disaster as well. So anthropologists have called disasters revelatory crises. And I became really interested in this topic of revelatory crisis. And one of the things that concerned me about that was that the idea is that a disaster lets us see things that we normally couldn't see. Right? Like, for example, Katrina hits New Orleans, and people in New Orleans didn't want to talk about race inequities, but all of a sudden, representations of the disaster show the inequity of how poor African Americans are treated, and all of a sudden, like, we can see what we refuse to see. And so for some disaster anthropologists, they want to talk about how these crises, and they're bringing this also off of the concept of crise revelatrice, I think is also Stalins's concept. And that's fine and dandy, but one of the things that concerns me about that is that when anthropologists in the field of disaster studies are usually very deeply rooted within the analytical perspective of political ecology, and political ecology is, I think, very good at telling us why a hazard becomes a disaster. and how it's transformed through human practice. And that's good for anthropological analysis, but it doesn't help us understand why do we sometimes experience a disaster and society as a whole doesn't transform and recognize what a disaster was engendered and actually engage in a transformation of it. So for example, here we start the presentation with the clip of Arnold Schwarzenegger saying, "Don't be economic girlyman," right? 4 years later, we're seeing an economic meltdown in the United States. And then 4 years later, or was it immediately in the aftermath? It may have been 2012, 2016. In one of the debates in the election between Barack Obama, and John McCain, the question was asked to John McCain, what is your recommendation for recovering the economy? And John McCain responded to this question with one word, and he said deregulation, which is amazing, right? It's amazing that John McCain is proposing that the solution to the problem is exactly what caused the problem in the first place, right? To deregulate. And that for many people in America, of course, people could argue, well, McCain didn't win, so obviously Americans know better. But I think it's still the fact that it was possible for McCain to recommend this, right? It'd almost be like saying, somebody is exposed to radiation and develop leukemia, so how are we gonna heal them? Let's give them more of the same radiation, right? Like, let's give them more of the same thing that's killing them. And the fact that it's possible to say this to me is absolutely fascinating. So if a disaster, if the stock market meltdown of the United States was a revelatory crisis, then why don't we know any better now? Because right now, under the Trump administration, we're doing exactly the same thing. I think the Trump administration right now is engaging in the type of actually criminal risk-taking that is guaranteed to create a major stock market collapse if we keep going this way, right? So we are still engendering. So if a disaster is a revelatory crisis, well, why does it not reveal the same things to all? And I thought that we needed to be more polyvocal in anthropology, that the disaster anthropology and risk anthropology has been too monovocal, assuming that everybody could see what we could, because we see the world through the lens of political ecology. But what happens if other people don't see it that way? So in that way, and you see how this relates to risk, right? Because it's about how does a disaster let us see the risks that we were taking, and see how that risk-taking behavior led to this. And if it doesn't, then how are people witnessing? What is the disaster revealing for whom? So that was the research question that we were asking. What does Hurricane Harvey reveal for whom? And we wanted to understand that first and foremost, Houston is a very complex city. It's a city, depending on where you slice its borders, is a city of 4 million to 7 million people. We're anthropologists here, right? We don't deal with examples. We deal with small communities, right? How do you do this? It's a huge methodological challenge. And I'll talk about my method design so fast in a second. So I got this grant, and as part of this grant, and I want to acknowledge we should always acknowledge the work of your research assistants. So I counted with the help of 3 research assistants. 2 of them from the University of Houston, Irene Martinez and Mayra Sierra, and Grace Vargas from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And a really interesting point about these research assistants is that Mayra and Irene, I think it's a very important point to make, they are both DACA recipients. That means that no human being is illegal, right? But within the American discourse of transnational migration, they would be considered illegal. They're people who they were both born in Mexico, brought to Houston as children, and they don't have a formalized status. They used to not have a formalized status with U.S. immigration authorities, and under the Obama administration, they were capable of becoming DACA, which is a deferred action program, that they would be allowed to stay in the United States and do things like go to college and work. And Mr. Trump is starting to take all this away. And it's really heartbreaking to meet young people who are living in a complete condition of uncertainty. It isn't a risk. They just don't know. They don't know what's going to happen. And to actually see what it does to someone's life, a young person who should be making plans for the future, thinking about what they're going to, it's not that young people should do this, but who want to and feel that they can't because they don't know if they're going to be, they are Houstonians. Irene may have been born in Durango, but she doesn't know what it's like to socialize in Durango. She doesn't live there. It's not part of her personhood, right? Her habitat, her way of being is a Houstonian. And to face this risk of deportation and to have to be forced to adapt to a completely new collection of life circumstances against her will is really a horrible thing to witness or to have to live through. So Houston is a big city, and we don't have a lot of resources. We don't have a lot of money. And anthropologists work with small samples. How are we going to do this? And I did a presentation of this for American University, and there was an economist there who couldn't wrap her head around ethnographic methods and ended up getting really angry with me because she just wouldn't understand how you do this work, right? And so I understand that Houston is an incredibly diverse city. There are people who, it's a global city, 7 million residents. There are people who are the descendants of European immigrants. There are people who are descendants of people who were brought under conditions of slavery from Africa. There are people who are, and most of them are descendants of unions between those two groups. There are people who also, Texas was at one point a part of Mexico. There are a lot of people who are the descendants of the people, the Latino people or the Hispanic people who lived there before Texas was even a part of the United States. And you also have people who are arrived from Latin America more recently. There are people from South Asia. There are places of residency of all kinds of diasporic international communities. My goodness, if you're an anthropologist, you shouldn't be doing the ethnography of an entire city. You should be choosing one neighborhood, staying put, right, getting to know it really well. But by the design of this work, I wanted to get a sense of this range and not make any claims to complete representation whatsoever, because with a sample of 60 people that we're going to be interviewing, you can't hope to. But I just wanted to get a sense, right, of that. And I wanted to be quite as strategic as possible and try to use my sampling so that it will be purposive. And we would get a little bit of everything, well, not of everything, but as much as we could of that diversity, right? Understanding socioeconomic diversity and everything. So one of the good things is that there's all kinds of community databases in Houston that you can look at maps and you can ask searching questions in the databases. Like I can look at databases that tell me this is, I can ask it, what are the neighborhoods that have a certain percentage of people who self-identify as African American or as Latino or that make such and such an income, and it'll give me these shaded colors for those neighborhoods, giving me a sense of the census responses. So I can get a sense of where is there a great percentage of people who let's say might self-identify as Latino in the U.S. Census and make less than $30,000 a year, and where are there classes of people who might self-identify as Euro-American or as white and make $100,000 a year or more. And then I can begin to think strategically. And then on top of that, I can overlay the flood maps. Where did it flood? And so if I want to talk to people who experienced the disaster firsthand, and then I can get a sense of where can I find people who self-identify as African American who flooded? Where can I find people who self-identify as white who flooded? Where can I identify people as Latino who flooded? And then I can also I can strategically try to go to those places and find those interlocutors. So, but how do I go to those places? How do I find those interlocutors? As an ethnographer, I always rely on what some people call gatekeepers, right? Sometimes it's probably not a good idea to just waltz into a neighborhood. You want to have people who have a certain social status within that neighborhood who will first vet you and make sure that your project is ethical or fits within their notions of ethics, that they give you informed consent, and then also volunteer to help introduce you to other people. And then you might use what I call snowball sampling, right, which is I'm not going to use a random sampling mechanism, but the people who I'm introduced to by these neighborhood associations, by these leaders, I'm going to ask them to give me names of other people and try to spread like the web, and try to get, and at least try to make sure that I get as much diversity, socioeconomic diversity within a neighborhood, and constantly check back with people and say, that's great, thank you for introducing me to that person, but are there people in this particular social echelon of your community that you can introduce me to, trying to get as much diversity as I can. And the first one of departure of our interlocutors, what I did methodologically was that I just looked up the contact information for neighborhood association leaders. So neighborhood associations in the United States are these organizations that are supposed to represent the interests in civil society of neighborhoods. And I got that directory, and I just went ahead and contacted neighborhood leaders of all the neighborhoods in Houston that were on there. And of course, not everyone was going to participate, but we got enough diversity, and we'll talk about that diversity in a second, that we're getting some really interesting results, particularly showing us what does Harvey reveal for whom, and what does that tell us about risk in this particular city. So, having said that, in the last couple of minutes, so here are some of the discourses. And again, if we're going to not understand risk as something that is specifically calculated, but understand risk more as this what was the word that I used? In this particular arena of contestation, then here are some examples of the hegemonic voices about risk. And here's the first one from Mayor Sylvester Turner. And this is the official discourse of the city of Houston about a particular concept that has a lot of prominence right now in the United States called resilience. And resilience is the idea that if if you approach disasters from a vulnerability theory perspective, you would say disasters are preventable, right? If we put the right policies in place, if we develop landscapes in a particular way, then a disaster, then a particular hazard doesn't be transformed into a disaster, right? So in Wenchuan, China, in many locations, if people had used the proper building seismic resistance techniques of construction, thousands of people would not have died. 80,000 people died during that disaster, during that earthquake, but that didn't have to be so. Resilience, however, is another idea. Resilience is the idea that disasters are going to happen. So the best that we can do is prepare societies and communities to weather them. So this is a really interesting way of thought because it's saying, no, we shouldn't be worried about environmental stewardship so much. We just have to make sure that we can do whatever we want to the environment, develop it however we want, and we just got to make sure when the hazard presents itself that we can weather it. And that's resilience thinking. So here's the mayor of the city saying, our city has experienced historic devastation with Hurricane Harvey, but it has also shown us the best in humanity. Throughout Houston's history, we have faced challenges and built a city that is even better and more resilient. This time is no different. Working together, neighbor helping neighbor, Houston will emerge better than it was before. So this is almost negating the whole idea of disastrous process, right? We've been building a great city. I didn't even know this disaster happened, right? It's a complete ignoring of, if a disaster happened, then vulnerability theory would suggest that people were taking certain kinds of risks, right? But in this particular instance, it's kind of this propagandistic perspective that we've been doing everything right. And so, if we look a little bit deeper into the history of Houston, if Mayor Sylvester Turner is saying, we built this great city and I've always built better than ever before, then what was that better than ever before that we've been building? And we could look at the person, Jesse Coleman Jones, who was the first chairman of the Harbor Board of the Port of Houston. And he, in 1954, was heralded as Mr. Houston. He is credited as being one of these entrepreneurs that made the city what it is. And here's a quote of an interview with him that says, I always said that someday Houston would be the Chicago of the South. And it is. Railroads built this town. The port made it big. Cotton and cattle kept it rich. Oil boomed it. And now we're the chemical capital of the world. Like, that's good. Like, we're the chemical manufacturing capital of the world. That's something to celebrate, right? Growing, growing, growing. That's Houston, right? So this is biopolitical society, right? Like we are creating this milieu that is going to reproduce capital and it's going to provide people with all the things that they need to be provided for as a living population. And it's not quite yet vital system security, right? Because Holman refuses to admit, as we'll see, that becoming the chemical capital of the world created all kinds of toxicity for certain residents of Houston, right? And that the tremendous exponential growth of Houston that was highly unregulated is the reason that Hurricane Harvey became the disaster that it did. Right, so it's a particular moment in time and a particular narrative about risk. And in this particular instance, right, there's not even, again, it's biopolitical and it's modernist, but it's not quite yet biosystem security as there isn't even a reflexivity about the risks that might be being engendered by this and for whom. So, and then Harvey happens, right? So let's look at the present, how people express themselves about Harvey. And this is one of Houston's favorite citizens, Leo Limbeck III. And let me see if I can pull up his quote, because this quote is pretty good and it's pretty important to read. So Leo Limbeck III is a really interesting character. He is the CEO, so he's a very wealthy executive of Aquinas Companies, LLC. And they are one of the biggest construction companies in the region, very powerful. They do lots of construction and therefore they do lots of alteration of the watersheds and of the material environment, and it's that alteration that actually converted the hazard of Harvey into a disaster. He is also, interestingly enough, he is also a professor. He's also an academic. He's a professor of business in the School of Business at Rice University, which is the big prestigious university in Houston. And so he wrote an article in the aftermath of Harvey titled